Welcome to Sensing the Signal. I'm Terry Patar from Atreides. We're exploring the overlap between data, technology and intelligence in our increasingly volatile and complex world, what this means for national security, and how deeper insight can help organisations make better decisions. I've spent the past 20 years helping organisations improve their intelligence capabilities. I'm fascinated by how we understand the world around us. Now I get to talk to some of the leading voices who I've learned from myself.
On this episode, I talked to Nico Dekens. Known popularly online by his handle, Dutch OSINT Guy, Nico is one of the foremost experts in OSINT, with over 20 years of experience as an investigator and a highly experienced trainer. Nico also shares with me a strong interest in applying critical thinking to knowledge work, and specifically the process of producing intelligence. Something that Nico warns is potentially being hampered by over-reliance on AI tools. Nico, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. It's an honor.
No, it's great to have you on. You are one of the foremost experts in open source intelligence. I've said this to you before. When you post something online about OSINT, I generally will read it because I know there is so much content and there's so much stuff being posted. It's not always easy to keep on top of everything, but I'll generally try and make an effort to read the stuff that you're putting out there because I've always find there's something useful and something valuable in it. And in particular, there was an article you wrote recently that really sort of caught my attention, and hence why I wanted to get you onto the podcast to talk about it. And that was where you wrote about the impact of AI and the current AI tools that we are using on knowledge work generally. OSINT specifically, but knowledge work more generally. It'd be great to get your thoughts on that and just get your input on what made you write it and what was the sort of main points and key topics that you addressed in the article for the audience listening who maybe haven't read it yet.
Well, first of all, thank you for your very kind and humbling words. Now it also raises the bar a little bit more for myself to live up to those expectations. Basically, and that's how most of my blogs are born. They're mostly born out of my own personal frustration, where I play around with certain techniques or tradecraft, and where I get frustrated where things don't work or I get uncertain outcomes. And the same basically happened with this article I wrote on how I think that critical thinking is slowly collapsing due to AI becoming more and more popular. So my approach in this case was I use AI every day. So tools like ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, you name it, I use them all because they are simply useful. We cannot deny that. But I also am noticing more and more that it makes me as a investigator very lazy, and that really stood out. And then I stumbled upon a piece of research that was done earlier this year by Carnegie Mellon and Microsoft on how in general, analysts all around the world should be more aware of this because it is literally becoming a huge problem. I see more and more people online posting stuff coming from out of these, what I like to call black boxes, like ChatGPT, and just taking these answers for granted without double checking them and verifying. And that's basically how my blog was born, trying to explain something that I encounter every day, where people are trying to work smarter with maybe leveraging tools like artificial intelligence, large language models, machine learning, which we should definitely do. But in my book, tradecraft is slipping away. So critical thinking and putting more confidence and belief in an outcome out of these black boxes without doubting these outcomes. And that's basically what I wanted to tell the world a little bit more about. I'm like, hey, if you're looking into, let's say, image verification, and you just randomly post that picture of interest into a tool like ChatGPT or Gemini, and you ask it, hey, where was this picture taken? And it tells you very convincing, hey, it was here in this city, near this square. A lot of people just assume that that's now the only and correct answer. And they forget that maybe if they just took some time to look at the picture themselves, they may have come to the conclusion that there were street signs in it that had nothing to do with that location that was now pointed out by an algorithm, basically. So they forgot to critically think or visually analyze the information itself, and they just took an answer for granted. And that's basically the point that I'm trying to get across within this blog that I wrote, that people just forget that they need to mandatory doubt everything. And especially when you're using an algorithm or machine learning or something like that, people forget that it's in the end, it's nothing more than basically mathematics in the background that are trying to predict based upon the question that you ask the best answer based upon the knowledge that they have. But people never think of, hey, but what if that knowledge is not in that database or in that repository? What if that knowledge is incomplete? It will give me an incomplete outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. Is this a trade-off that people are making between speed in terms of they're in a hurry to get to an answer quickly versus the quality of the output? Like, are people consciously doing this, or do you think a lot of it is unconscious? Everyone's just piling into using these tools because they think, well, it's just easier, or it'll have a more comprehensive answer for me than I can possibly get by myself. What's your sense of how people are maybe falling into that trap of coming up with the wrong answers because they're over-reliant on these tools and not critically thinking enough about questioning the outputs?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's a mix of both. I think it's a mix of the urge that they feel, the urgency of certain topics that they need to investigate, so they want to deliver fast. And this is where these tools give you a very fast answer. Maybe a funny example is recently I gave a talk at a closed law enforcement conference where I showed that these large language models nowadays can do what they call deep research. So they're basically capable, based upon a prompt, to perform quote-unquote research. So let's assume I'm interested in, for example, in my country, the Netherlands, we have the NATO summit upcoming. And I just want to know what to expect civil unrest-wise, because almost every NATO summit involves people wanting to protest. If they have a right, but most and foremost, law enforcement is all for protest, but they're against violence. Or at least that's what they're hired for to do. So they want to get a grasp of what might be going on. So you could ask ChatGPT, their deep research function, hey, perform some deep research on historical protests in and around, let's say, NATO summits. It will do research. So it will read 160 pages from the internet in, let's say, under 15 minutes, and then will summarize basically the content from those pages and give you an output in the form of, let's say, a 2-pager briefing style. People assume that everything that happened during that research process was done thoroughly and double-checking and verified. And again, I'm a human. I cannot read more than 160 web pages in 15 minutes. That's just something I'm humanly incapable of.
It would be impressive if you could.
Yeah. And now you have that weird trade-off. Like, hey, I've got an answer that looks very convincing, because that's also how these models, their output, they formulate their words so convincing that it looks so accurate and so trustworthy that people just take it for granted. And I think that's the balance that I'm missing. Yes, I use the same techniques, but if they point out certain details, I want to make sure that at least the research that was done automatically points out the sources. And now I can go into these sources manually and validate the outcome from a summary. Is this accurate? Is this true? Is this maybe outdated information? Is it interpreted wrong? Is it interpreted from a different angle? Are there multiple ways to look at the same information from different angles to make sure that there was no bias in play or something like that? So it's a trade-off between speed, but I also have to admit that I see very well-seasoned analysts like myself becoming more lazy, because again, it is so convenient. But I also see new folks entering, in this case, my world, open source intelligence, OSINT, and all they know is this new technology. They were not raised like I was 20 years ago when the internet was just beginning, and all we had was tradecraft and critical thinking and our own brain. So it's kind of a mix, to answer your question.
Okay, interesting. I mean, one of the reasons why I was struck by your article was that the topic of critical thinking was already important. It was already something I know you've written about and others have written about, and I've certainly talked about to people within the OSINT field and also outside of that. And another point I wanted to make is on your article, and you wrote about this in the context of knowledge work more generally, and maybe that's something we can come back to. But in terms of critical thinking, it's something that was, I think, already difficult for people, and maybe was already kind of I don't want to say lacking. That's maybe the wrong word, but I don't think people were applying enough critical thinking to the information they were collecting, using the tools and methods they had already, let alone with these LLMs and other AI style tools that we have now. Was that something you were seeing, that you were observing already, and do you think this is sort of compounding that issue?
Yeah, I think so, yeah. I think for me there always has been a difference within any form of intelligence collection between information and intelligence. So people collect information, but it doesn't mean that it's now intelligence. That the intelligence comes from processing and exploiting and analyzing the collected information to create actionable intelligence. So to tell someone, this is what it means to you, or this is what it means to your research question. Now with the new technology, collecting is more easy than ever, but also the step of processing and exploiting is now done in more automagically ways, not even automatically ways, but more, I like to call it automagic because...
Magically. I love that word, yeah. Yeah. That's
because
a good way
basically I cannot explain... Let's just say when I was working at government, every now and then you need to show up in court and explain the steps that you took to get to a certain conclusion. How can I now go into court and say, hey, I asked a question into a black box called Gemini or ChatGPT. It spit out an answer, and this is what it is, and this is now the truth. I cannot explain it because I cannot explain what the algorithm in that black box is actually doing. So this is why I think you always need to rely on manual tradecraft. This is why for example, I give that then versus now examples in my blogs where I say, hey, back in the days, you used to see a blurry image. You open it in free tools. You zoomed in, you rotate, you look for metadata. That probably can tell you something about the make and model of the camera, or if it was manipulated. You reverse image search it manually in search engines. You look for social media posts with the same narrative or same pictures. And you at least validate every step manually. Now we just paste that information into an AI tool, we read the suggestions, and we move on. And I think that's where my concern is. We should not just accept the suggested information. We should try to validate that. And that comes back to your question again. The tradecraft is slipping away, and the tradecraft is super easy for me. My golden rule is the 5W1H methodology. So who, what, where, when, how, those questions. And that is applicable to every form of research. Everything that you find, you can ask this question. So who posted it? Why did they post it? When did they post it? What's the intended audience? What's going to happen with this information? What do I want to know? There are so many questions you can simply ask and then manually try to answer with either using traditional tools or just use your brain. You don't need a, let's say, sophisticated AI tool to think on your behalf.
I mean, and in some ways it's kind of strange that we think of, I mean, you're thinking of search engines when you talk about traditional tools, right? And making use of, smart use of those search engines. For people who are maybe unfamiliar or haven't yet kind of delved into really using the AI tools to any great extent, how would you describe the difference between using an AI tool versus doing that workflow of taking the information or taking the question that you're trying to answer, putting your search terms into Google, or taking an image as you described, reverse image searching it on a search engine and seeing the results that come up? Because ultimately we have limited insight into how a search engine works, I mean, it's not quite the same in terms of being a black box, but it's still a system that is giving us some answers back. So what's kind of the difference there between that and some of the AI tools that we have now?
I don't even think there is that much of a difference. I just think people should look at their role more as if they are an AI overseer or challenger or verifier, by simply making sure that they double check everything. For me, AI is nothing more than a assistant that I can use that can speed up my processes. So when I ask a question in Google, I get maybe 5 pages of results, and now I need to manually sift through them and see which one might contain information that I want to collect, and then later on process and analyze to come to a certain conclusion. Now I can basically ask a similar question in an AI tool like Gemini or ChatGPT or Claude. But now I think my next task as an analyst should be is to doubt the answers. So I can ask AI a question, but then I need to interrogate these answers. I can ask it to create a summary, but now I need to dissect that summary. I can ask it to give me suggestions, but now I need to break those suggestions apart. And I need to validate these narratives. I need to rip apart basically the answers and try to see if I can manually validate these outcomes. And I think that's a topic that is overlooked, or I think in a lot of cases not even done or thought about.
And so is the key there that it's the way the results are presented back, that the AI tools are kind of presenting us an authoritative answer as opposed to a series of links to different sources, essentially, which is what you would get from a search engine.
Yeah.
Is it sort of, it's almost like a UI or sort of UX kind of issue in the way that we engage as users with those tools, right?
Yeah, and also just maybe comparing these models against each other. I've had numerous occasions where I've seen it making, let's say, a statement, and I ask it the same question in a different tool. So let's say I asked the question first in ChatGPT and Gemini, and I got 2 completely different outcomes based upon exactly the same question. And that, again, makes me doubt, hey, what didn't it cite? Can I compare it maybe against a real-world source that I can find myself? Or maybe now ask your question, what isn't it telling me? What is it overlooking? Or what is not in its own knowledge base, so it literally cannot give me an answer at all? And again, this all comes back to critical thinking, doubting everything, assuming nothing, and checking and validating everything. So I think the analyst role is now more important than ever, because we are now basically that final barrier between a delivery of a product and screwing up the delivery of a product. We need to validate everything.
And I guess this is the thing, as these tools become more accepted, more used, more automated in a way in terms of the connection between people asking questions and an output being produced or a final product being produced, for me there's almost that danger that they can create a deluge of answers to questions for not just people working in OSINT, but people working in any kind of knowledge work field. And like you said, the role of the analyst is becoming more important because you've got to apply some expertise to that to be able to stop that sort of deluge of information or those answers that look like proper answers when actually, when you examine them carefully, you realize, wait, this is not right. And that's where these tools are still lacking. I know when I've used them and I've asked for an output and I've asked it to give me the sources that it's used to produce the answer, I've always been very disappointed in the selection of sources and the limited number of sources actually that they will use to generate what looks like on the surface a reasonable answer to a question, and something that you could put into a report or something, and you think, oh yeah, that's done the work for me. But then you actually examine it more carefully and realize, wait, it actually hasn't.
Yeah.
It's given the impression of having done the work, but not actually done it to the standard that we would do it.
Yeah, and sometimes it even hallucinates or make things up, and
yeah.
just what you said is also, I think, really resonates with me. I know for a fact that a lot of these AI models or platforms are not indexing everything, just like a search engine like Google is. For those who are a little bit more technical, you can place a little document on your webpage called robots.txt, where you can tell a scraping tool that it's not okay for them to index your webpage. Now, I know for a fact that a lot of news outlets, for example, prohibit ChatGPT and Gemini to collect information into those models, which then also immediately implies if I'm going to ask a question to these boxes, they cannot access those websites. So they cannot access that information, which means we now have an information gap coming out of these large language models. Some of these large language models don't have internet access at all, unless you pay for it. And then you also need to know, again, it's limited access to the internet. So this is why you will always need to validate these outcomes. This is why you will always need to manually search certain things, because you don't know what is being indexed or what's not part of that knowledge base that model is trained upon. So yeah, there's a lot of things to keep in consideration.
And I briefly touched earlier on the difference between OSINT and knowledge work, and I wanted to really get your thoughts on that, because that's, again, something that struck me about your article was that you were really talking in terms of knowledge work generally, because ultimately this applies not just within the kind of areas that we're maybe engaged in day to day, but for anybody who's working with information and is doing research and is going online to try to find, bits of information or data or whatever it is they're looking for. That's kind of a lot of people, right, who are doing work on various different topics and in lots of different organizations around the world. And a lot of them are now starting to probably use these tools. And so this impact that we're talking about is not limited to a small number of, researchers or OSINT analysts. Yeah. It's much more widespread, right?
Yeah. And I think that resonates, Lily, with one of the quotes I made in my blog. I'm like, because the moment when you let a model do the thinking for you, you stop being an investigator. You become an operator. And I think that is so important, because when you do research simply takes time. It's a very structured process where you need to make absolutely sure, first of all, what is my main research question? And that's always something that I try to really emphasize on with clients, because typically a client, when they come up to you or a team leader, I think we've all seen this. Friday, 4:00, there's a problem. Someone comes in.
Oh, yeah, classic.
Nico, tell me everything about this topic, or tell me everything about this individual. And then my immediate answer would be, what is everything to you? What do you mean with everything? No, I just want to know this or that. Well, now at least we can define a quote unquote answerable question with maybe a potential subset of questions that could help us pivot or corroborate the information that they have. And then the next question is, what do you already know? What can you share with me information-wise that can help me get started? Could be maybe names, could be locations, could be background information, could be culture information. So I can do my research, because I need to understand, where is this information potentially somewhere online, for example? Where can I find this information? What are trusted sources? What are less trusted sources? Do I need specialized access to forums? Do I need specialized access to, let's say, social media platforms where I need to authenticate for me to be able to see information at all? And then I need to tailor my searches in such a way that I get highly accurate information, because now I'm collecting information. For me, collecting information is creating your own haystack. And in the end, I want to find that needle in that haystack. So I want to make sure that my haystack of information is as targeted as possible with, let's say, the least amount of noise to be able to find that needle in that haystack, but still having enough flexibility to expand that haystack if I come to the conclusion that I've got information gaps, or there's information that contradicts other things in my hypothesis or in my initial research question. So And that again, that comes down to taking the time to do your research. And that's something that you simply cannot do in 15 minutes. It takes time. It takes time to think, overthink, process, analyze.
Yeah, so it's essential, really, isn't it, to know what is the range of information from which I'm drawing to help me answer the questions that I've got in front of me, so you can understand, okay, what are the limits I've placed on that? Like you said, you want to you don't necessarily want everything that's out there. You want to narrow it down. You want to get rid of some of the noise, but you still want to have enough there that gives you confidence you're going to be able to answer the requirement. And then you can potentially go out and expand on the information you've got if you need to.
Yeah.
That's exactly what's missing from these tools, right? They don't give you any insight into, and even when you ask them to tell you where are they getting their information from, I don't feel like I'm always getting a straight answer, or if I am, it's a very disappointing answer. So I guess that's for me the crux of the issue in many ways, is that it is that black box aspect that we just don't know what they're doing behind the scenes to give us what they're presenting to us.
Yeah.
And I always feel I have this slight tension whenever I use these tools, and I'm thinking, I think I could do a better job.
Yeah.
And if I was doing it, like you said, the more manual way, or the ways we've maybe done it, I don't know if that's, I guess the question I had in my mind was, is that just me being biased towards my previous ways of working, or actually is there genuinely a need for me to be thinking that? And I think what I've taken from what you've written and the conversation we're having is that no, actually that was a valid concern for me to have.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and I think if listeners are interested in this, I would like to encourage everybody to just go over to ChatGPT or Google Gemini and ask a very basic question. Maybe tell me about Amsterdam City. Just that question. And now wait until it gives you an answer. Then close your browser, close that chatting tool, and reopen it again. Or open a new chat with that chatting box on ChatGPT or Gemini and ask the exact same question with exactly the same words in exactly the same word order. And then observe, because you will get, let's say, an 80% same answer, but it's always different. And this is my point that I'm trying to make. It will never give you the same answer twice. Never.
So is it then, is it an issue of trust, ultimately? Do we just not trust these tools?
Yeah, I find that very difficult to answer, because I've had multiple occasions where the answers were highly accurate and highly trustworthy because I was able to fact check and double check and validate them. So, and it is improving. I think half a year or a year ago, it was just bad. These answers, and it was not good. And it's becoming better. And this is where I think it really becomes scary, because again, we talked about this earlier today, is that the way these answers are formulated, are presented, are so convincing that it makes it appear or look like it's highly accurate. And I think that is something that will never change. Of course, these models will improve because they retrain it, we have people checking it, and it really is getting better. But again, the model is only, let's say the outcome is only as good as its model. So if the model doesn't contain a very specific detail that you're looking for, it will not give you a conclusive or, let's say, a waterproof answer. So this is why I think in the end, should always be a human in the loop that validates any outcome out of any form of AI.
And with the tools that are currently out there, the ones you've mentioned, what's the kind of, maybe you could describe your workflow. How do you implement those tools within a workflow that maybe combines the best that those tools offer with the positive aspects of the traditional workflow you've used and the methods you've used to go about doing your research and to come up with answers? How do you currently use them?
Yeah, good question. So I use it very often to understand a little bit more about background or cultural backgrounds or other topics. So recently, for example, I needed to investigate a sensitive topic in and around an African country. I had little to no knowledge about that country or the cultural aspects of it. But that's very important for me because I need to know what motivates those people there in relation to the topic that I was investigating. But I also need to understand a little bit more about the geopolitical backgrounds of that region of the world. And this is where at least, in this case, ChatGPT gave me just enough to get started, to maybe then manually go into sources that will give me more in-depth information about that topic. Another example that I can give is, for example, I monitor a lot, which means that I monitor for keywords on certain topics. Now, my mind can sometimes only come up with so many keywords about a topic. Maybe a simple example is I'm a sneaker collector. I love sneakers, but I also like to investigate people that are selling fraudulent sneakers or knockoff sneakers that look like the real deal.
Nice.
So it means that I need to understand the slang and jargon that people are using to advertise these falsified sneakers. And this is where tools like Gemini and ChatGPT can push me in the right direction. They have a very large knowledge base and they tell me, hey, this is a list of words that are commonly being used by people that are selling counterfeit sneakers. And of course, it's not let's say, a conclusive list, but at least gets me somewhere, because now I've got a bunch of keywords that I can search for on maybe social media platforms where they advertise it, and that will help me uncover these advertisements where I can learn about how they word and phrase. So that will help me find more words that I can add to the list to be more targeted. So I use it as suggestions. I use it as giving me background, but I also use it a lot for coding. I can program in Python, but my fingers cannot type as fast as ChatGPT can.
Yeah, fair enough.
And sometimes you just want to have, let's say, a quick and dirty script that can parse a piece of data. So let's say I have got, 200 PDF documents, and all I need from those PDF documents is to extract all the email addresses that are in there. Now, of course, I can whip up that code manually, and that will probably take me an hour or two to whip up that code because I don't code every day. But I can also now use ChatGPT or Claude, because Claude in my book is a little bit better at coding, and say, hey, this is my goal, this is my data, this is my desired output. I want to achieve this goal within Python. Build me the code. And in my personal experience, that code almost instantly works. Maybe I need to iterate it over maybe once or twice to fine-tune that piece of code. But in under 10 minutes, I will have full working code. And that, again, at least gives me more confidence, because now I can review the code. I can see that it's doing exactly what I want it to do. It's not doing any malicious things. It's not communicating with a secret server. I'm in full control. I'm just speeding up my processes. Or it will help me process and exploit the data that I've collected earlier in my investigation. So I use it in multiple ways.
So that's really interesting where you talk about using it for coding. I feel like that's where we're also touching on maybe the difference, or some of the differences between maybe OSINT work and knowledge work more generally. It would be great to get your take on, I guess, kind of when we talk about OSINT, what are we talking about? And I know it is used in various different ways now, and there's lots of different flavors of OSINT, but maybe from your perspective, what's the kind of work you're involved in right now? And, how does that relate to perhaps some of the things we've been talking about, and how are you, how are you applying the stuff we've discussed to specific use cases?
Yeah, so basically my entire career, the past 3 decades, has been in and around finding criminals, nation-state actors, hackers, pedophiles, art thieves. So individuals in my book. And individuals can be just an individual, or it can be an individual that's part of a group. Which means that they have backgrounds, they have regions that they live in. So you need to understand about culture, you need to understand geopolitics, and there are numerous ways how I investigate stuff. Sometimes it's very simple. Hey, we have someone that is threatening to do a school shooting. This is the post that we found on Reddit where he announced the school shooting. We need to identify who this is because they're posting it under a moniker, under an alias. Then you use tradecraft, you search by usernames, maybe you find some leaked or breached databases where you can find a username that's connected to an email address, and I've got an email address. Maybe I can use that email address and find out what social media accounts are connected to it, and that may help me maybe discover a profile picture. He made an operational security mistake. The profile picture shows a building in the background. I can tie it back to a location, find his front door, and basically de-anonymize. That's one of the examples. Other ways could be to monitor general geopolitical topics, maybe financial influencing, maybe cryptocurrency schemes, maybe disinformation campaigns during election time. And that's more a broader topic where I'm trying to monitor. And this is where, for example, the company that I work with, Shadow Dragon, we try to build these tools that will make your collection part easier, where you have more time to do the actual analysis. And I think that's what I'm focusing on most. I want to be as efficient as possible to give me more time back to do proper in-depth analysis. And this is where I need specialized tools, because the problem is 20 years ago, I could do almost every investigation by hand, manual, because the internet was, let's say, small enough for that. There was not, let's say, 500 social media platforms where one user could be active on, not 200 million forums and news outlets that I need to look into. So it was digestible. Now it's just too broad. So I need something that scales for the collection part again to give me more time back for the analysis. And this is where you always have a trade-off between maybe a pay tool and some manual stuff just to be more efficient in what you do. And this is also funny within OSINT because everybody is always looking for the silver bullet solution. And I will tell you now, there will never be a silver bullet solution. It will always be a mix of free and pay tools as well as traditional tradecraft and forms of automation. It's always a mix of all these things. And that's what I think is overlooked. I see and hear, I teach classes all over the world. I attend conferences all over the world. And for me, what really stands out in the past 5 years, everybody, literally, people asking me, Nico, do you know a tool where I can push a button and the tool will tell me, this is my suspect, or this is what I want to know? And I just look at them like, do you really want that? Do you really want a computer to tell you that this is the suspect that you're after? And they're like, yes. I'm like, are you absolutely sure? And you still have people saying yes. And I'm like, well, maybe you don't. And then I try to explain them again. If you have an algorithm, but what if the algorithm overlooks or is not trained on a specific data set or it doesn't have certain knowledge? Now, it may point out the wrong suspect, or it may not point out a suspect at all, but it still might be in your data, but the model is just not able to pick it up. So this is why I think the collection part can be automated, but the analysis part can only be automated to some extent. We can do very basic stuff. So, of course, we can automate facial matching. So if let's say I collect 200 social media posts, allegedly from the same person, and this person posts selfies all the time, I can throw an algorithm on top of that and just point out, hey, show me similar faces or exactly the same faces. That's where models are pretty good at. Or maybe quickly transcribe a foreign language into a language that I can understand without wiggling out, let's say, figure of speech or misinterpreting the information. It's getting better at that, but it's always a mix.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you talk about that. People just wanting to push that button and the tool give them the answer. I definitely come across that. I definitely hear people who just want the easy button. And you're right, it doesn't exist, and most likely never will. But even if it did, or even if somebody claims to create something that did that, I would find it very difficult to trust it. So we want that insight into what's the process and how is it doing what it's doing, and some of these tools just aren't able to give us that. It's fascinating, the range of work that you've done and the kind of investigations you've been involved in. I know at some point you've previously you started your career in law enforcement. I'm right in thinking, and you've gone on then to work in open source intelligence. What kind of made you want to get into open source intelligence, and yeah, what was the sort of start point for you? We were thinking, okay, now actually that I want to get involved in using information that's open and out there, to do these kinds of investigations.
Yeah, I think I've always been that typical computer nerd. I started out with old Ataris and Commodore 64s and Amigas. So I always was interested in technology and databases and collecting information. When I started out in Dutch law enforcement, one of my first roles when I became an analyst was investigating criminal youth gangs. Think of gangs like Crips and Bloods like you have in the US. Almost every country has similar phenomena. So I was tasked to analyze those groups based on internal police information. At that point, the internet started to become booming. We had MySpace, Facebook started, and I was like, what if I could compare the information from internal information from publicly available information and just see if the outcome will still be consistent? Meaning, maybe during my analysis, I identified a guy that's responsible for the finances within that gang or group, or someone that fulfilled a leading role, or someone that was nearly a facilitator. Would that change if I looked online? And the conclusion was yes. Outcomes very often changed. Who we thought the leader was by looking at the online presence, it was basically nothing more than the foot shoulder that was the loudmouth on that square when local police interviewed them or talked to them. So this made me very aware of, hey, the internet contains so much information, so much more than any, let's say, internal database for any company. So you can just think, let's just say Amazon. They have a lot of databases. They have a lot of cloud services, but it's still only a fraction of what can be found on the entire internet. So if they need to do, let's say, competitive intelligence, they can look at their internal information. But if they're not using the internet, and with that I mean the entire landscape of the internet, and that's always the three layers, the clear web, the deep web, and the dark web. So the indexed internet, the non-indexed internet, and the internet where you need specialized software to access it. You need to look at all those layers to at least get more information, to get that complete or completer picture. And that's what I think what really resonated with me, how I got started and got excited about open source intelligence, because I can honestly say I can see way more information and get way more insight than I used to have with government databases. And this for me always is also so funny, because every now and then you see mostly the journalism world point the finger at, let's say, secret services like NSA or the Dutch AIVD, saying, hey, they collect everything. They're throwing out a dragnet of information. Have you ever thought about Google doing something like that? Why aren't they never pointing the finger at them? Because I think most Western governments, at least, are very restricted when it comes to collection capabilities or what they are legally allowed to do. That is totally different in the commercial world. So the commercial world is collecting data at scale about you, about me, but it also means that that data is very often just publicly available. We can find so much information about anyone.
Yeah, I think the challenge there also becomes not just that they've got those sort of legal restrictions on them. I mean, the government and law enforcement agencies,
which is a good thing, by the way.
It is good. I mean, certainly from a private citizen perspective, they need to have boundaries to information that's gathered and what it's used for, etc. But I think one of the downsides becomes that they also don't always build the capabilities to handle the mass of information and data that's out there, and they rely on maybe commercial actors to come in and help them with that. I guess they're also restricted in whether their ability to use the kind of AI tools that we've talked about. Do you find that those are the organizations that maybe don't have as much capability when it comes to keeping up with the latest developments in information? And although we've talked about some of the negatives of these tools, is that a real kind of drag on what government and law enforcement agencies are able to do?
Yeah, I think it really depends on on most of the time budget, but also on good leadership. There's a lot of hesitation, which is very good within all the governments that I talk to, which is mostly the Western governments. Well, I think almost only, if not only Western governments. They all want to use forms of AI, but they want to be in control, which is a very good thing. They just don't want to outsource it to a third party where they have absolutely no control about these models. So they want to run preferably everything on premises so they can control all the little gears, so they can double check everything. And that's, I think, a very good thing. And I think that's also something that we as individuals should strive for a little bit more. I run a lot of these models locally just because now I'm a little bit more in control and I can also check into these models, which is also very challenging because I don't have all the knowledge on how these models are trained. That's for me very often rocket science. But luckily, I can reach out to people that have that knowledge. I can raise questions. I can frown and say, hey, I don't understand. Can you explain me? I need to understand this because I'm going to use this tool. I need to understand exactly how this is going to work and how the output is being generated. And I think that's what I'm seeing, that trade-off between, and I think most of the time the trade-off now is everybody wants speed. Everybody wants an answer yesterday. And it makes sense because there's so much information that they cannot or they will not allow themselves the time that they used to have to do investigations because there's simply an overwhelming amount of information. Just like I said, when I started with those youth gangs, I could do almost everything manually. If I would do exactly the same task now, no one's going to grant me permission to spend, let's say, 8 hours a day for 15 weeks looking into 15 individuals that are forming a gang. That's too expensive. So they're like, hey, this needs to be done in 2 weeks, which means I will need specialized tools to at least achieve certain goals, to still have enough time to properly analyze and doubt everything that's coming out of the automated tools.
That's a really interesting point you've made. I mean, these tools and the capabilities that they offer are maybe making people more impatient in terms of, you know, what they think is involved in the level of effort that is required to go through a large amount of information to find leads and to find useful pieces of intelligence or create useful pieces of intelligence from the information that you've gathered. Do you find, is that also something you're seeing more of, that people are starting to get kind of a greater urgency around doing things, or expecting things to be done faster with more information than actually is reasonably possible or would have been possible in the past?
Yeah, absolutely. I truly think that sometimes people just want to see everything just because they can. And again, that's that balance between nice to know versus need to know. And that's what I think, that balance is kind of out of balance nowadays, because there are these powerful tools out there that will give you a lot of nice to know information, but not always what you need to know. But it's just easy to collect that information. I think that when you look at that again, I also think that people are not taking enough time to do due diligence on the tools. Because if I'm buying a tool, I need to understand its pros and its cons. So if it's capable of, let's say, looking into a vast amount of sources. When you look at the company that I work for, we are capable of looking at a vast amount of publicly available sources. But there are also at least the same amount of sources that we cannot look into. What does it mean for me as an investigator? That means that if I'm going to open the Horizon tool from Shadow Dragon, I only have limited visibility. I can still see a lot. I can see an awful lot. It's like really a lot. But I need to understand that there will always be sources that I need to pivot into manually to complete my overall analysis. And that's what I think is maybe even more important. And that comes back to that comment I made earlier. There is no silver bullet solution. There is no tool that can scavenge the entire internet for you and give you an answer. It's always a mix of multiple things. And again, this is why you need to use your brain. Hey, I can use this tool for this. And this tool gives me this output, and I have another tool that can complement that tool. Then I have another tool that I can use to analyze the output from both of these tools. Then I can input that output into another tool to maybe visualize the outcomes. And that's how I approach my work. And this is why this is also what I think what differentiates what I like to call an OSINT expert versus a beginner, and we all need to begin somewhere, is that it's a difference between collecting just information versus collecting information and turning that into actionable intelligence by taking structured processes and steps to make sure that you interrogate your information, that you analyze your information, you doubt your own biases, you don't jump to the conclusions, you don't make assumptions. And that's what I think is slowly collapsing. The part where we use our brain to say, okay, let's identify the pros and cons. And what do we need to do to tackle most of these gaps?
That's really interesting. I think that's really useful advice for anybody, not just, but especially people who are getting into this field, maybe at the outset of their careers or whatever. That using that structured process that you described is so important, and it can make such a big difference to the way people go through their information collection and analysis. And I think people just don't realize that sometimes, and they don't put enough thought into upfront planning that process before actually diving into the information and starting to gather all of the information that they need, and then getting lost.
Yep.
But you talked about different tools for different things that you would use. How do you keep on top of new tools that are coming out and that may be useful and maybe solve issues or problems that other previous tools didn't quite address? Or there's so much. It seems like there's so much going on in the OSINT space, in knowledge work more generally. How do you stay on top of it all?
Yeah. Well, first of all, that's very challenging. That it really is. But I've and this is something that I talk about in my lectures and classes. I've always claimed with any employee or anyone that I work for that hires me is what I like to call nerd time. And nerd stands for never-ending research and development.
Nice.
Which means that, for example, when I was in law enforcement, I needed to stay on top of the food chain, which means if there's a new tool, I need to be able to test it and thoroughly test it, and that takes time. So I claim time. Every Friday, I had at least half a day to just install maybe a GitHub script that I collected, or test a tool that was released somewhere, or reach out to my peers in my network and just ask them, hey, do you know about a tool that can achieve this goal? Or do you know about a source, because I need to look into, I don't know, a bird's database because I found a picture of a bird and I need to understand where that bird lives. So this is what I do a lot. I network a lot. So I have people that have a certain niche within OSINT that they really excel in, and they are my knowledge base now. If I don't know something, I will reach out to that individual. And of course, I just, through the years, I basically curated my own sources. So I know about certain social media accounts that always give me knowledge about new tools and new techniques. And that's what I do when I wake up in the morning. I take my morning coffee, I look into my feeds that I've curated myself, and I just handpick the ones that are important to me in my investigation. And then I use that nerd time to apply those new tools and techniques and try to learn and read. So and I think that also separates a novice from an expert. For me, this is not just my 9-to-5 job. And I know I'm a little bit weird, but I think that really is now, if you really want to be really good at this, it means that you never stop learning. It's not just following a 6-day course or a 2-day webinar or somewhere and now you know. No, because every technique that you learn today will change or will be outdated at a certain moment in time, which means that you will always need to be able to adopt and adapt to become that adept again, or at least to stay that adept in a certain topic and niche. So I read a lot, I learn a lot, I talk a lot, and I just try a lot. There's a lot of trial and error going on in my life.
Got it. Yeah, I mean, that resonates with me, and certainly I do something similar to you, where I sort of will read through and scan quickly, the kind of the people who I'm interested in following and learning from, and essentially that's how I came across your article too, and how we've come to have this conversation. And this has been fascinating, Nico, and I'm hoping it gives people a bit of an insight into how they could use these tools beneficially without some of the downsides, or without getting sucked into being over reliant on the AI tools, certainly. Have you any other kind of advice you would give to people of how to get that balance right of using the tools but not quite, suffering the downsides? Any other tips you would give?
Well, my main tip is use AI. Start now, because you better start learning now, because this landscape is evolving every day, every minute. So you need to, if this is your jam, intelligence collection or open source intelligence, or in general, working with data, you just need to learn. You need to learn how to create prompts, how to ask the right question. I think my biggest advice is, while you're doing that, think critically, you trace evidence, you challenge assumptions, because that's your job. Don't let a machine think on your behalf. It's just an assistant that can speed up certain processes that always needs hand-holding. It's almost like you're teaching a 5-year-old something.
Oh, that's challenging. Yeah. I guess one more question I've got is you talked through earlier about that, having that knowledge and understanding of what life was like before these tools and before even the internet was really a useful resource. What do you see in terms of maybe a generational difference now, or are you concerned that there is any kind of generational difference between people who are starting their careers perhaps and are using these tools very, very early on, perhaps without having that grounding and without maybe having been drilled through so many investigations or so many times of researching using more manual methods? What could I don't know, are you seeing any of that? Are you working with people in that generation who might be already kind of, I don't want to say over-reliant, but are maybe employing these tools in a way that they're not learning some of the other skills that you have built up over the course of your career?
Yeah, for sure. So we work a lot with interns, which are significantly younger than I am. Yes, I'm that old. Now what I see is that there are pros and cons. They are very fast at knowing and understanding new apps and platforms, because that's all they know. They know the world as an app. It also has its downsides. I'm noticing more and more that youngsters have a problem with interpersonal contact. So just a simple fact, making a phone call and asking someone a question. There are a lot of youngsters that do not want to talk on the phone because that's uncomfortable. They want to send you a text message on WhatsApp or Signal, but they don't want to hear your voice because that's intimidating, because now something unexpected can happen that they didn't prepare for, or they don't feel that they have enough time to give you an answer. And that's, let's say, I think a downside. For me, it feels like that the younger generation is super connected in an interconnected world, but they are very disconnected from the reality of the human world that we live in. And that's what they forget. The world is not your screen that you're looking at. The world is the place where you can literally set your feet on the ground and walk around, drive around. That's the world we are living in. And of course, the internet is a part of that. But the internet for me is what I like to call an emotional landscape, an emotional war zone that has a very huge disconnect from the real reality. And that's what I think is a downside. And another downside or difference I see is the new generation is used to buying hardware devices, so phones, tablets, computers, out of the box, and they just work. I come from an age where we needed to build our own PC, so I understand what makes that machine work, which means that it also makes it easier for me to troubleshoot those devices. So I literally understand a little bit more what's going on underneath the hood, just like you will pop up the hood of your car. Modern cars nowadays, you can hardly fix anything in the engine. And that's basically the same for hardware and software. Everything is now just locked down ecospaces where we have less control and we are being controlled by these algorithms. And I think, it's two ways. I come across many youngsters that teach me angles and approaches or platforms that I've probably would have never thought of because I'm just too old for that. It's not my world.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's a very strong lack of knowledge, basic fundamental knowledge.
That's really interesting. And like you said earlier, I think that's not always something that, people can learn it on a course, but they won't learn to apply it day in, day out necessarily. So I guess there's that element of, okay, can they do all of that and learn and adapt and apply those new tools? I love your description, by the way, of the internet being an emotional war zone. I'm definitely going to use that. So I think that's fascinating, and I've really got a lot of food for thought coming out of this conversation, and I'm sure everyone listening has done as well. Nico, it's been great to talk to you, and this has been a great topic to discuss, and it's very timely. I don't think it's going away. I'm sure this is going to be an issue that we'll continue discussing in terms of how we interact with AI capabilities and the tools that are coming up. But yeah, thanks for your time. Thanks for having this conversation and giving us your expertise, because that's you're coming from the forefront of the field and really able to spot and see things that maybe everyone else isn't seeing because we're all busy doing stuff. but yeah, that's been amazing. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, and hopefully some listeners will join me on the dark side and informing other people about the things that we need to know about.
Absolutely. Where if we want to direct people to, I said I've already said at the start that all the stuff you produce I definitely look at. If we want to direct people to where they can follow and find more of your articles and keep up with what you're putting out there, where can they go to?
I think the quickest thing you can do is just Google or search in any search engine my username, Dutch_OSINT guy. So I'm Dutch, I'm from the Netherlands, I like OSINT and I'm a guy. Then you will find my blogs, you will find the company that I work for, Horizon, you will find the SANS Institute that I teach for, and you will find all my social media accounts. So I'm active on all the platforms, so from LinkedIn to Blue Sky to X, I'm everywhere. So just follow my username, DutchOSINT guy.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Well, I'm sure people will be looking that up after this, and I think there will be some people also probably searching for what a Commodore 64 is.
Yeah, let's hope so.
Yeah. Thanks, Nico.
All right, thank you.
How are AI tools affecting the way we think? And what impact is that having on intelligence production and indeed all knowledge work? These are the questions I think we should all be addressing as these tools become more commonplace. Nico has really flagged up the risks that are inherent with current AI tools, and I think the way he's described them, using them and doing it in a way that mitigates the risks, really comes down to a trained mindset. Analysts should be able to integrate these tools into their workflows, while also being vigilant about checking the outputs and verifying sources, and not simply taking the output of an AI tool at face value. Now, that probably sounds like common sense, but as Nico pointed out, these tools are producing outputs that are increasingly convincing as complete answers to questions, rather than simply smart inputs to a broader research and analysis process. The term Nico used, auto-magically, is a superb way to describe the capabilities of these tools, as they process a mass of information faster than any human could, but without revealing how or why they produce certain answers, and, crucially, without any indication of what they might be missing or leaving out. There are undoubtedly benefits to using AI tools, but we have to consider carefully their limitations and how we employ them to best effect across any intelligence or knowledge work discipline. If anything, using AI tools won't provide us with an easy button, but working with them may actually require more critical thinking than working without them.
Sensing the Signal is brought to you by Atreides, the behavioural analytics company. If you enjoyed this conversation, you can find out more about what we do at atreides.io.